Remember when talking about anything paranormal was super taboo? I feel proud of keeping those conversations going, at least since having my first experience back in 1991. Over the past 20 years since that time, I've heard countless stories from friends, family, and total strangers, all of whom have invariably, upon hearing me talk about my experiences or what I do, either instantly shut down and laughed me off, or jumped at the opportunity to share their story with a kindred spirit. I like to think of myself as a safe space for anyone to talk about, well, anything weird. You might say weird is my specialty. Welcome back to Going 5D with Destiny Dawn. I'm your host, Destiny Dawn. By popular demand today, I will be sharing with you some of my experiences, and even bringing in my favorite paranormal enthusiast, writer, and blogger, having penned Quiet Mouse Strikes Back for nearly 15 years, my hetero life partner and husband, Bryce McLaren.
Hello everyone, this is Bryce McLaren, aka Quiet Mouse 420. Glad to be joining y'all today.
For those of you who don't know, I had told Bryce about my haunted house from childhood. I even referenced it in my book, which he had read pretty early on in our relationship. But it was kind of hard to sell him on the idea of moving into that house, especially less than a year into our relationship. So how did you feel when we first moved into a haunted house?
Well, honestly, even though I've had paranormal experiences in the past, I was taken aback literally because on day one, started seeing things, and it hasn't ever stopped since then.
How did you feel about the idea? Was it like daunting or scary or looming?
Yeah, it was definitely a little intimidating. I mean, everybody sees all the TV shows and all the scary parts of hauntings, but they don't see what it's like to actually live in that kind of environment.
So jumping right in, I have talked often about my first encounter and all the things that we did that we shouldn't have, but realized later probably made things worse. But after about 6 months or so, I didn't really think about it as much as you might think. Back then, you didn't have, paranormal television show producers, Reiki masters, shamans, Wiccan priestesses, nobody you could call to get rid of spirits or do blessings. You basically just had the clergy that, you just kind of assumed were going to be there if shit got real. But you didn't reach out to them unless it was a last resort. Since we didn't want people thinking we were crazy, that really was a last-ditch option. Especially since there wasn't even a way that you could learn to do it yourself. It's not like the internet now where you can learn how to cleanse a space yourself. Even incantations you can use. No, nothing like that. We just learned to live in a haunted house. So after, the novelty wore off, I pretty much only thought about it when something would happen. Which was always just this unexpected thing that kind of just scared the shit out of me. But looking back, whether it was when a jewelry box of mine flew off one of my shelves while I was laying in bed in the dark, lights flickering in our brand new house, or hearing whispering coming from my parents' room, it was never negative, but always scared the shit out of me and most people who came to visit. So I thought I would share a few of those encounters, a few more of mine. Then I would talk about your experiences, Bryce, and how we've helped each other deal with hauntings since then. Then we'll close out by talking a bit about what you can do if having a televised paranormal team at your home, if you don't really feel like doing that, you don't have internet, or you just don't want to hear from some regular folk about how you might cleanse spaces, rid yourself of negative entities, and when it would probably be a good time to reach out to a professional. As I mentioned, I wasn't really thinking much about my weird house, except when it would make its presence known, or when we would play Ouija. But I did seances first, and that was weird enough. So by about 14 or 15, I want to say someone, I think at my cousin's 15th birthday, which would have made me 14 at the time, they drew out a Ouija board. I want to say it was one of my aunts. I don't remember. I just remember someone did it, and they told us how to play. And that was entertaining for a period of about 2 years after. And that's when some things might be perceived as scary. Not so much for me, but for a couple of friends who had some scary experiences. One who actually had a razor fly up at his face. But then I got all pissy and yelled at whatever was here that was messing with my friends. But before that, before the craziness, there was this period of time where I knew it had happened and was kind of secretly hoping to experience that same thing again that I had when I was 12. So, fast forward a year, I was 13, several seances, possibly some dares to do, a sort of variation of Bloody Mary, some other stuff that we weren't supposed to do. It's really a miracle that something worse didn't come through. At this point, I was 13 and I had to share my room with my aunt, who was sleeping in my bed, and her 6 or 7-year-old son. We were both laying on futon mattresses one night on the floor, sprawled out in each direction of my floor. I remember how many questions this kid asked and was just laying there trying to pretend I was falling asleep in hopes of him following my lead and shutting up. Each time he would ask another question, I would make it sound like he woke me up again and like I was all annoyed. That's kind of ridiculous to me. Out of nowhere, just like before, when it did happen the first time, it felt like someone was watching me. Only this time I was laying on my back. So opening my eyes to look up towards the ceiling, it was her, the same woman that I had seen and was hoping to see again, making the same face as if wondering now who the hell my cousin was. It was just her face though. And because of how it manifested, which started out as this kind of ball of light that just sort of suddenly had a lot more definition for like 4 seconds, just about the same instant that I realized what I was seeing was really there, it occurred to me that this kid was going to freak, and I tried to calmly tell him not to. But he was one step ahead of me and screamed out loud. At which the woman's face vanished and never reappeared, at least not in front of me. So then when we did start doing Ouija, there was usually 2 or 3 of the same entities that we were speaking with, primarily one in particular who said his name was Ivan James. But usually he went by IJ. Now I have no doubts that he existed because I tested my own friends and family and would ask him to tell me things that nobody else knew. The most compelling was a specific thing that I had muttered under my breath earlier that day. Nobody present could have known about. That turned out to be one of those pivotal moments in my life because not only did I feel validated about what I had seen and experienced, but in that it was an intelligent enough response to communicate with me in a way that confirmed, in a very special way, unique to me at that time. There was also a neighbor next door whose daughter was experiencing paranormal activity to the point where they went and saw a psychic. And now I was friends with a friend of the mom's. We were working together, and I knew she had a best friend in the center, but I didn't know where she lived. So one day at lunch, she was telling me this story about how her friend went and saw a psychic because of paranormal activity at their house in the center. And she told me what the psychic said, which was very interesting. They said that the ghost was there and that it had come from the neighbors next door, the one that used to have all the dogs. And I just got this feeling in my stomach like, oh my God. And I said, where does your friend live? And she described my street. So what's funny about that is that my dad used to raise and train dogs. So part of our yard is actually sectioned off. It was a dog run and there were dog kennels out there. So stick a fork in me. Anyway, so some people were creeped out. But IJ had told me back then that he did follow me to protect me. Making me sometimes wonder, but I wasn't creeped out. I don't know, I just didn't get the creeped out feeling. Then there were 2 women that frequently communicated. though not so much. And one seemed to have trouble communicating, as if there was a language barrier or something. And sometimes the letters, like, were incoherent, so it didn't make sense. Someone suggested that she may have been Native American, and something she said led us to believe that. I also happened to be living on or nearby former Native American sacred burial grounds. I mean, I've heard that so many times, though. I'm like, seriously? I didn't believe it for a long time, but it turned out to be true.
Yeah, it turns out it's right down the street underneath the trailer park.
Right. So, and beyond. For whatever reason, though, talking to that particular lady, it always felt like this calm energy, just slower communication. Now, I will say, I did not understand at that age, though, how many Native Americans were reformed when their settlements were taken from this. I say this because the woman that I saw twice, but one time wearing a dress, I recognized to be colonial. So at the time, I totally separated her from being Native American. I thought, how can they be the same person? Because she's wearing this colonial dress. But understanding Reformation and how that works now, I think it was the same person. I suppose she could have been wearing that if she was going through the whole Reformation thing. Now, the other woman, she communicated more than that one, but still not as much as IJ. But she was a strong presence when she did make herself known. I believe she liked attention, and she would be the one to mess with lights, perhaps even through the razor. And I wanted to share a story about her. Actually, that's going to be my first story. So, this actually happened a little while after where we were just talking about. This was a couple years later. By this time, my parents were going through a divorce. I was usually with my aunt and uncle babysitting, and I had some friends here, though, at the house. We were all supposed to get together and go to a party. I was working at Taco Bell, and I had been babysitting, so my aunt had agreed to bring me home. So I get home, and my friends had been here, I don't know, I can't say for sure, but I think maybe half an hour or 45 minutes. And I walk in the front door, and all of my friends are just in chaos. Everyone's trying to talk at once, and I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? And there kind of becomes part of you when you know you live in a haunted house, where you don't necessarily think of it first thing, but then somebody says, we just saw something, and I'm like, oh shit, what did the house do now? And one of the guys took the lead in telling me the story, and then other people would add things in, you know how people talk. So apparently, here's what happened. So there were a couple of girls who were finishing up on their makeup in the main bathroom. And if you're in our house, you walk in the front door and you're in the living room. Kind of goes to the left. And then you can see from one side of the living room all the way down the hall. You can either go down the hall to your right, or you could go into the dining room to your left. And so from about the last third of the living room, as you're heading into the dining room, you can see all the way down the hall. So these two girls were getting ready and had walked back into the living room. One of them said that they had heard noises. I don't know. But as they walked into the living room, one of them went to sit back down by her boyfriend and was getting comfy when the other one heard something and looked down the hall, which prompted the boyfriend of the other girl to look to see what she was looking at. I think he might have heard something too. They both looked down the hall for a minute, and then eventually they claimed that there was this figure that they saw something move. And so now they're waiting to see if something else happens, and other kids start noticing them staring down the hall. By the time that it actually made a move, there were at least 3 or 4 people watching. And I think I had 6 or 7 people here. But I distinctly remember 3 or 4 different people that witnessed this. And what they said they saw was a girl look from out of my room, which would have been on the right side of the hall, poke her head back in, and then dart across the hall. But that she went slow enough that everybody was able to see her clearly. They all said she wore a white dress, that she was a tall, thin woman, and they couldn't see her feet very well, but they could see her walking. Then, as everybody freaked out, there was like 1 or 2 left that were still kind of looking down the hall while everyone else was freaking out, and that she went back the other way. And the main person, the boy that took over the story, was one of those people that kept watching. Because he said he just had a feeling she was going to do it again. Or he was hoping, maybe, I don't know. But he saw her and someone else saw her. So everybody had other stuff that they added to the story, but that was definitely the consensus on what happened that most everybody had witnessed. And so that was just a really interesting story, and I always felt like that was what we called the mischievous one, because we always considered the 3 that we frequently communicated with to be IJ, who is the calmer, more protective one, which was funny to hear about that psychic situation with the daughter next door, because it was a teenage girl that was going through teenage angst. And apparently one of the reports of activity was that the girl ran in her room, flung herself on her bed, and her parents went after her and tried to open the door but couldn't. And there was no lock on the door, so there was an issue there. But he was just a very protective spirit, and I think that's why I never really got a bad vibe from him. But, moving on, all of those things connecting were significant to me.
Well, and I think that's why lately he's been showing himself again more. As we spend more time with having our grandson over, he seems to be coming around more in that same protective spirit. We've seen him 3 times now in the last month or so, and it's always been when the grandbaby's here, and it's always been a feeling of protection. There's never any negativity or angst.
Did I tell you about the protective part?
Yeah, before.
Okay. Yeah, so I always got a good vibe from IJ. But I'll have Bryce tell you about that here in just a moment, because there's more to tell on IJ. Another one of my friends had an experience back then too. And this has, whatever her name is, written all over it. We called her the mischievous one. Written all over it. So my mom had these Harlequin masks, like hanging in her bedroom. Really nice ones, actually. Usually made of porcelain, covered in glitter, feather, the whole shebang. It was a bummer most of them were broken by the time she moved out. She said this was nighttime, and so she's laying in a dark room. We don't have phones back then, so odds were she was probably listening to music. That's like what we did. And she said that out of nowhere, the whole thing instantly lit up, as if someone had taken a picture, is how she described it. Like a flash went off. A split second later, she heard my sister screaming from across the hall in my mom's room, where she was freaking out about one of those masks flying off the wall and shattering everywhere, which seemed odd even back then. I won't claim to be a brainiac or anything, but I had several instances of this myself, and always found it weird when a glass-like object would not only fall about 4 or 5 feet away from where it had been, but was shattered everywhere. Now, I could see it breaking, but like in the case with my jewelry box, it did that too. It shattered into like a million pieces, and I just remember thinking that was really weird, because it wasn't like it was 10 or 20 feet up. We're talking, 5 to 7 feet at most onto a carpet. And so it was always weird to me that it was like something small that shouldn't break into more than a few pieces, I would think, breaking into like a million pieces. But maybe I'm just wrong about that.
Yeah, and you can't exactly write that off as, somebody slammed the door and shook the house or something weird.
Right. So after we moved in here together and experienced a bunch of activity, we learned how to do all of these things to clean cleanse and protect us from anything negative, which we then use to help other people. Now, I want to say really quick, too, because I didn't get a chance to talk to him about it, but there were other people that had experienced things with the masks. One in particular who happened to get sick while I was waiting for the stories for my friends and family to come back in, but it's a worthy mention. One of my cousins, when he was young, he was just a toddler, and when I would have him over to babysit, I would lay him down in my parents' room, and he would freak the fuck out. He did not want to be there. I laid this kid in many beds, in many places, at families' houses, and he never had a problem. But in that bedroom, he freaked out. He would not stay in there. He was convinced at 3 or 4 years old that the masks talked to him. And what was peculiar about that is there's no way he could have known all of these other people that were hearing the same things, because that's what my sister had said she had heard before that mask had fallen or flown off from the wall, was that she heard whispering she thought was coming from the mask, which is why she was looking at it. So I just wanted to mention that. There's a lot of things with this mask. I'm really glad they're not here now. So anyway, after we moved in together and started doing the cleansings and things and learned how to do that, we started helping other people. As I was preparing for this, I had a really hard time deciding which ones I wanted to talk about, but I thought maybe the old Gypsy Joker spot would be a good story to tell from one of the cases that we did. So I'll tell that one too before we move on. My paranormal group, formerly, I don't really do much with it anymore, Southwest Washington Paranormal Society, we had started reaching out to the community to see if people needed help. And one of the most interesting cases that people were asking for help with was this one, which was quite a drive away for us. It was like an hour. Bryce is over here nodding.
I think it might have been longer.
And so we had to drive to BFE to go check this place out. But it was really compelling, and the lady made a good case. So I really wanted to go there. And it was interesting because apparently the former owner, which was the parents of the clients we were working with, had been a member of the Gypsy Joker gang. So that kind of piqued my interest. And I didn't know about them. I never heard anything about them. And so I reserved any judgment or much research until after I went out there, because I didn't want it to impede on anything that we picked up on or any conclusions that we would have formed. So we went out there with very little information about what the Gypsy Jokers were. I had heard of Hell's Angels, but I never heard of any other biker whatever gangs. I still don't know a lot about them, as you can tell. But when we went around the property, and I want to mention here, I think all of us are intuitive, and so I think that if we are open to it, we would all receive messages like this. But as I was walking around the property, one of the first things that I noticed is that it felt like multiple things going on based on what she was telling me and just the vibe of the property. But it was a couple of acres, and it was split up. So the family lived on one area, and they had somebody renting from them living in another area. And the former owner, the father of the husband, had recently passed away. So he had an area too that was now vacant. And then they had the shop area. We did a canvas of the whole property, but there was this one area in particular where it was kind of, as you walk through the center and then towards one of the former gates, I got this voice in my right ear, and I remember distinctly it saying, "This used to be a sacred place." And I just got all of these chills run through my body. And I just thought, oh my God, what did they do here? What happened here? And that's what I asked. I was like, what happened here? I feel like something bad happened here, because that's the vibe I got from that. And so the husband and wife gave me this really shocked face. And I don't know why they wouldn't have told me this by now, because you would think you would have talked about any ugly past that you were aware of. But they acted like it was a surprise, like they didn't know anything bad had happened on this property when they reached out to us. It was mainly the fact that there had been this gypsy joker gang there. And I assumed there being a gang, there was some shady stuff, but I did not expect anything like this. So they said that there were a couple of what they assumed to be like tortures in the shop. And one in particular, a man went missing on the property somewhere. And for whatever reason, and I can't substantiate this, but an image popped into my head where this guy was strung up in a shop into these rafters with a cable, and this cable was somehow clamped to an engine. And so the man was hung. And I don't know if that happened or not, but that was like the image that popped into my head, and our imaginations can run wild, so I didn't really do anything with that. But if there was somebody that went missing on the property, I have no doubt, based on the feelings that I got and the information that was provided to me, that he was probably to some degree tortured or killed violently. And I have a sneaky suspicion that there was more than just one. So I never did go back and look at disappearances of men around. This would have been in the late 70s, early 80s in the Southwest Washington region, northern Southwest Washington region. So that might be something I'll have to go back and do one day. That was, I think, my favorite case. We caught a couple of images of other things on the property, but the most compelling part was the hauntings they were having were actually not related to that. Like, there was a bad energy. We did do some cleansing on the property. There was kind of a bad energy there, but it was mostly coming from the deceased father, is the vibe that I got. And we went back to the house, and it was sad that these things had happened, and we tried to restore some of that sanctity, some of that, healing, love on the property. And so when we left, not only did we do the cleansings, but we sat down, and it probably sounded very much like therapy between the ghosts and the living there. Turned out that the father had a lot of expectations and frequently expressed disappointments with his son, and that the son was harboring a lot of guilt. And knowing what I know now, I wouldn't even doubt that the son may have been manifesting his own PK entity, but whether it was the ghost of the actual father or a PK manifestation, working through it stopped the activity. And there were all different people reporting all different types of activity on this property. So it wasn't like it was just the husband, but when the husband's issues were resolved with what he at least perceived to be the ghost, all of the activity stopped for everybody. And that was the most interesting part. And the lady next door had actually caught things on camera. She had a little camera, and this was like 2016, 2017. So they weren't quite as common yet. You didn't have people that had cameras everywhere. So I was really intrigued by this, because she had so much going on around her that she was like, either it's an animal or it's a ghost. And she was really kind of hoping for an animal, because the kind of ghost that she caught really freaked her out. It looked like, the best way I could describe it is a semi-transparent goblin. And I don't know what it was to this day, but I just remember like the volume of reports that had been given of things that people had seen on the property, and them looking like, now that I am where I am later on, I kind of feel like it might have even been some kind of cryptoid or something running around there, but we never followed up. I mean, we followed up a couple of times, and I really like how that story ended. But it's not uncommon for hauntings to sound like therapy. So I just had to share that because I really found that an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where I was going to lead into. Speaking of being therapeutic, that reminded me of the story of the guy who came to live with us while I was going to culinary school over a decade ago. We decided to help out one of the students who didn't have a place to stay and let him stay with us. And pretty much the same way it was with us when we moved in. From the minute he got here, he was having experiences. And, of course, we had to put him up in the room that has the most hauntings in it. And just like when I'm here alone, were other times where he was here alone, and it was a common occurrence to hear the sound of, like, footsteps, and specifically it sounded like boots on our hardwood floors going down the hallway. And they often would stop at that first bedroom where he was staying in. And so he was already a little weirded out because of the experiences that he had had. And then we stumbled into another experience in the house where we were taking magic mushrooms and having a psychedelic experience. Yes, in a haunted house. Well, when you're together and you're in a close environment that's supernaturally charged, it's not uncommon for people to have shared experiences, even though taking psychedelics is mostly a subjective experience. There are times when that rolls over to more of a collective experience. So me and said person were laying on my bed, and at the time our bed was near the window facing towards the master bathroom. And it had been said before that our house was a little bit of a train station for the paranormal because of the portals and stuff that had been opened in the past through the Ouija experiences and whatnot.
That's what I nicknamed it.
So both myself and this other man saw the same exact thing. We saw the door to the bathroom like invert itself like a vortex, and there were black images, like people with no features, just tall black images, going in and out of this vortex, true to life with what psychics and other people who had come here in the past had said about this house being a portal.
We hadn't told him about all of the different things. He knew it was haunted pretty early on, and we had talked about that, but we kind of just made a joke out of it because we didn't want to scare the shit out of him. He didn't have a place to stay.
Right. And so the irony of, what was said before by Destiny was that this kid, not only did he pack his shit and move out, he quit going to the culinary school, moved back home to his mama, and wanted nothing to do with. We didn't even talk to this kid for another 3 or 4 years after that, probably, until he finally, enough time had passed where he had gotten over it. But it definitely changed that kid. So sometimes, the investigations and stuff you do to help people with their paranormal experiences have helped, but there's some people where paranormal experiences don't really help as much.
Which brings us full circle for today. If you have a lingering energy that does nobody any harm and you are okay with cohabitation, that is an option. We have found, though, the key to removing paranormal activity is to have boundaries. Whether you cohabitate or want to get rid of it, the key is boundaries. And to talk about that with any incarnate beings also occupying your space. If you are experiencing paranormal activity, most of the time this works really well. You just state your expectations, set your boundaries, especially combined with sage, Palo Santo, frankincense, and myrrh. At least those are my favorites. The idea is that there has to be some kind of ritual, set of beliefs, and empowerment, which are imperative to successful cleansings. Be firm. State that your uninvited guests are not welcome and demand whatever it is to leave the property.
But it has to be stated out loud. That part of the intention process is to verbally, out loud, tell these beings that they are, not welcome in your space, if that's what your intention is.
Right, like we had talked about previously with the laws of the universe, you have the right to live freely, and you have the right to control your space at a cosmic level, at a universal level. You have free will. So you can make something let go of you, leave your space, or what have you. You just have to demand it. You have to make your intentions clear. Same goes for if you don't mind something being here, then you have to state that, but also put what your expectations are. Like, I'll say, any entities that are not for my highest good or not here out of love and kindness are not welcome here. Because some aren't. And that's just the reality of it, which we'll get to. As strange and impossible as it may sound, never give any being power over you by being afraid. Ignoring it or getting pissed off, again, as weird as it sounds, or getting pissed off and then ignoring it, is really effective alone. Despite all the activity countless people had in my house and others that we've investigated, it was not uncommon to have one person who insisted that they never had experiences at places where we would have a lot of experiences. I believe it's because those who are open to it, in a sense, invite it or welcome it to a certain degree. Sometimes it is appropriate to not be open. My dad and stepmom had lived here for a number of years between me and my sister, and while my dad would never admit it, even if it did happen, my stepmom did ultimately admit that there had been activity and a number of strange occurrences that even she couldn't explain, but she never admitted it to us until we were well into our 30s, because she didn't want to play into it or get us excited or make us worried, she said, but that she did have some experiences here, which I found really interesting, though my dad swears up and down he never had anything. And I don't doubt that. I've heard that before. People who were just completely closed off to the idea usually didn't have experiences. Like our son Liam. Knowing the history of their property helps too, since ridding yourself of a clingy ghost can often sound like a therapy session, like I was talking about before, such as in the case with the Gypsy Joker case. A lot of healing came out of that, but not without a lot of honesty and tears. There was some serious shadow work right there. And the last update that I got from them was that everyone was happier. Not only had the activity reduced substantially, there was still some stuff going on outside, but inside the house wasn't happening. But also that the husband's cancer went into remission, and he even participated in a 5K run the following year. While there might be some extra work that needs to be done, in 90% of cases, these simple steps are effective. If it isn't, it probably isn't human anymore, or perhaps never was. In this case, you'll need to reach out to someone who specializes in that thing, like energy work, clearing spaces, cutting energetic cords, like a priest, shaman, or Reiki master. It has helped that I am a Reiki master and a shaman. This will address another 8%. I'm totally making those numbers up, but you get the idea. Of which I would liken to what people consider evil, though I do not believe it works that way. Instead, I believe that those 8% just communicate energetically and could give a shit less about what you believe in or have to say. These beings tend to prey on the weak, sick, or scared people that feed on their energy as a result. I believe that they're oftentimes actually a living entity that just doesn't have a body. And we're just not able to perceive it because of the limited spectrum in which we're able to see, which I talk about in my previous episodes. I'm fortunate enough to not have faced one of the remaining 2%, but I do believe that there are entities that create an environment that mimics a haunting, though they are not simply inhabiting it, which is the key difference. These are what most refer to as elementals. At some level, they become part of or attached to the land, possibly in more ways than one. These are not yet well understood. And at times, I have thought that what we understand to be fairies and incarnate beings, those ones that really don't communicate with you, but like curses, living curses. Like a cursed land or a sacred land takes on an energy of its own. And it's tied directly in with the land. You can't remove that. It's not possible. Same with something to do with fairies. It's like they set up shop and they're not going anywhere. And I found one, I think went viral about Ireland, but I found other ones too where there are just some spaces that are not allowed to be built on. And I think that it kind of goes hand in hand. But the things that we understand to be like demons or cryptoids, especially non-corporeal ones, even some aliens, what some people would call aliens, I consider all of them extra dimensionals because I think that they're just beings without bodies. That falls under the 8%. The 2% I'm referring to here are things that are attached to or part of the land. And in that case, good fucking luck. These are types of situations that I feel like only a bulldozer can remedy because I think that there are some places that are just not meant to be inhabited. And that's a perfect example. As a reminder, though, the key is to not give in to your fears. As discussed in previous episodes, there is no such thing as good or evil. Just as a spider or a tiger would easily try to feed on you if it could. Being focused on using you for sustenance, though, is not necessarily good or evil. They don't even conceive of that. The only instance where that might come into play is with ghosts. And in that case, those are ghosts, I believe, that when they died, they believed that either they were bad, they had some kind of fucked up situation happen to them that they probably needed therapy for, and they, over time, once they died, morphed into something darker. And by their perception, evil, because that's what they had been taught and conditioned in their lifetime.
And true to the analogy you just made about talking about good and evil, what's good for a spider might not be good for the fly.
Exactly. And sometimes you're just the fly. But again, you have free will. If it's a non-corporeal being living outside of your 3D dimension world, they're not allowed to touch you. That's why I think that the people that are not open to it, let's use my dad as an example. Let's say if he was here in the living room and he heard something, but he didn't give it any attention. He just ignored it. He's like, nope, and he explained it away. I think the thing that was either intentionally or unintentionally trying to get his attention or did something that would have otherwise gotten his attention, unless he had directed his attention toward the other thing would not have been able to perceive him either. Or even if he had been doing it intentionally, would not have been able to make that connection.
Well, plus, just like a lot of things in life, there's a degree of consent involved. People's minds are closed and they're not consenting to the experience, then they're not going to have the experience.
And I think one day we will discover those subtle layers within that spectrum and why we're not able to perceive all of what we could otherwise. Like cats and dogs can perceive more than we can. So I think that's why you see them looking into different directions and reacting to things that we can't see. If we don't react to them, they just move on. They don't keep trying to do it because they're not going to keep trying to get a response out of you. So that's a powerful tool to use. If you're not prepared to deal with something, don't react to it. Just walk away. Even if that means you have to walk outside for a few minutes. It will pass. But giving something power over you truly does exactly that. It gives them power over you. It consents in a certain way. I hope our stories and this information helps to empower those of you who will go on to face ghosts in the future or who have already. That is my hope in sharing my knowledge, and that you might even find some of it to be entertaining. Next time, we will be talking about the process of taking all these types of experiences, spiritual growth, inner or shadow work, or enlightenment of any kind, and what to do after your mind has been blown, your perspective forever altered. Integration. What does it mean, and how can it help us on our journey? Thank you to Bryce and to all of you, our audience, for joining us today. Love to you all. Until next time.